Good evening.
Good evening, Professor.
Good evening, Professor.
Okay, so your first exam grade will be out later this week or early next week. So we will continue with what we talked about before the exam. So last I think we ended at function, right? So we talk about how to call a function, how to use a function, and we also did few example on how do we write our own function, right? So to write a function, we need a title line in the block, right? So the block is where we put our code in to write the test for our function. And for the title line, there's three things, right? For each function, we have the result type, function name, and the input specification. So you will start with your result type followed by the name, and in parentheses, you will have the input specification. Now for to specify your input, it's like how we declare the variable, right? So you will have the input type followed by the name. And those variable, right, that those input are called the parameter when we call the function. So if you remember before the exam, or when we talk about function or when we call the function, we also use the term argument. So argument is the term to talk about input when we call a function. When we use a function, we refer the input as the argument. And when we write the function, we will refer the input as the parameter. So depends on the name, you know we are whether writing the function or we are using the function. So argument is the name of the input when we call a function, and parameter is the input when we write a function. Okay. Now let's look at some example just to review how do we write the function. So let's say you want to write the cube function, which will calculate the x cube. So if you give an input, it will return the qubit of your number. And let's say the input are the integer, right? So you always take an integer input. Anyone?
Can you repeat again, please?
How do we write the cube function? Right, so for example, in the main function, so let's say you have C out cube 1, and let's say cube 2, cube 3. So how do we write the cube function? Now I see people have x times x times x, right? So that's just x cubed, but how do we write the function? And remember, when we write the function, we need to have the title line and we will have the block. So how do we have the title line? Okay, so I see here we will have int, right? So we know the result type is it will return an integer. And the function name, we call it cube, and then it will take an integer input. So let's call it x. Now, what will the block of code look like? What does it return? Right, so we want to return the cube of the x. Okay, I see people have, you can have int x equals to x times x times x and then return x. So that's one way you can do it. Or since we want to return the x cube, then we can just return x times x times x. Right, so that will be it. Or since you want to return the cube of the function. Okay, so here we have the qubit function, and then we want to print out the cube of 1 plus 2 cube plus 3 cube. What do we expect that to print out? I see people say you don't need a for loop for it. There's no need to do a for loop since the cube function, we just do it, we just print this, you just need to multiply x 3 times.
Professor, can you just quickly explain argument versus parameters one more time? I didn't get it the first time.
The parameter for the title line here.
What the difference in the meaning is.
Okay, so the difference between parameter and argument is they are both term or the name of the input. So one will be the term for the input when you are coding the function, and one will be the term you will use when you call a function. So if you look at here, right, when this int cube, int x, this is when we are writing the cube function. So this int x is what we call the parameter, right? This int x is the parameter of the function, right? So parameter means the input specification. Now in the main function, we call the function, we have cube 1. Now this 1 is the argument of a function, since we, like, so you can think of the argument is the input we pass in to the function. So they both referring to the name of the input. So difference is one you use it when you call a function, one you use when you write a function.
Get it now. Thank you.
Okay, so the output, right, we will expect it to be 36, right? Because 1 cube, it will be 1. And then 2 cube will be 8, and then 3 cube will be 27. So here, if you have 1 plus 8 plus 27, that will give you 36. So we will expect an output of 36. So we will compile it and run it. Right, so it will give us an output of 36. Any questions here?
Hello?
Mhm.
So what's the reason why you wrote in cube, in X and return X? Well, why did you write that? The blue part.
Okay, so this is the function. This is the cube function. That's a question, right? The question want you to write a cube function that will calculate the x cube for you. So this is a function. Without this function, if you just run the main function here, you will get a compiler error because you didn't define what's a cube function. So you need to write this function on your own. I see people asking, is the cube in the standard library C math? No, but you can use the power function. So there are functions in the standard library for you to use, but here the question here is ask you to write your own function. Right. So the reason we have it, so when you see in the main function, we call this function multiple times. So instead of manually do 1 times 1 times 1 for 1 cube and 2 times 2 times 2 for 2 cube and 3 times 3 times 3 for 3 cube, you can call it whenever you want to calculate the cube. Okay. Are we good here?
Yes.
Okay. Now, for the next example, let's say you want to write your own max function. Now, this max function will work like the following. So let's say you have an int. So here's your main function. Let's say you want to see out max of 5 and 7. It will return to you 7. And let's say you print out a max of 7.9 and 5.1. It will return to you 7.9. So how do we write this max function? Okay, so I see different title line here. So I see people start with the double and then have the function name max and then double x, double y, and I see people have the int max, int x, y. Okay, so if we look at it, when we declare okay, so if you look at our function here, right? So we have the function name max, right? And it will take in right? Here we taking integer, and then we also have double. So here the input, it should take in both double, right? Because when you declare as a double, you also taking the integer type, right? The 5, it was just reading as 5.0. And then 7. When you print the 7.0, it will just ignore the 0.0, so you will still get 7. But you need to have the double type in order to read in the double. Okay, so the and then it will return a double, right? If you look at the second one, we have 7.9. So we have double max, and then it will take in 2 input and both double. So you need to have double x and double y. So even though the 2 variables here have the same type, you need to have the data type for each variable. So when you do the input specification for the parameter, you need to have the data type followed by the variable for each for each input value, right? For each variable, you need to have the data type, right? Because I see people have just the double x, y. Okay, now in your main function, then you need to determine which function is bigger. So you check if x is bigger. So if x is greater than y, then you will return the x value. Otherwise, else you will return y. So that will be your function.
Professor,
Yes.
is there a way to make the function where you can take any number length of inputs and determine the max from all the inputs? Maybe with like a while
Yes.
or something.
Yes, but we need to learn how do we store those data, right? Since you want to create like an arbitrary amount of value. So we will learn that later when we introduce array. But since for now, we will just deal with you will take in the input where you know exactly how many value or how many input you will need. So you will put it into the parameter, right? So in the parameter, it will be specify how many input you need and what are the type of those input. I see people ask, what does the return x and return y do? So the max value, if you look at the main program here, when we print the main, when we print the max function with 5 and 7, it will print. So it will return to you whatever the larger value of the two number. So if x is greater than y, that means x is larger than you want to return the x value. Otherwise, you want to return the y value. Okay, I make a typo here. This is not 7.0. This is supposed to be 7.9. If you look at here, it will print us 7 and 7.9, right? So between 5 and 7, the max value is 7, and between 7 and 9, the max value is 7.9. Any questions here? Okay, now let's say you want to write a say hello function. Which it will work like the following. So it will ask, so it will prompt a message as who are you, and then it will store your, let's say it will store your name, and then you will run the say hello function, and you will pass in the username as or argument, and you will terminate the program. Now the say hello function here, what it does is it will print to the screen, or you can think of it will print to the console. It will say hello, and then whatever the username you pass in. So let's say you pass in the user Alex, then he will say hi. It will say hello, Alex. Okay, so how do we do that? So what will the title line of this function be? Okay, so I see people point out a good question. So I see people asking no C out before the say hello function. Yes, there's no C out. So what this function does is it will print hello to the user on the screen. So that's what this function will do. Okay, so I see okay, so I see two type of title line. So I see the title line start with string and start with void. So we might think of the say hello function will start with string, right? Because we wanted to print out something. But if we want to use the string return type, that means when you run the function, right, it will return to you a string, right? It will return to you a message, and wherever that string, it will be a replacement as the function. So remember when we call a function, wherever the result will be replaced as your function, right? So if you remember, we did earlier, like the first two example, right here, when we see out the cube 1, cube 2, cube 1 plus cube 2 plus cube 3, what it does is it will take the return value for cube 1, which is 1, and would take the return value for cube 2, that's 8, and then return value of cube 3, so that's 27, and then you add them, you will get 36, and you will see out the value, and we will get 36 from it. For the second example, we want to see out the max value of 5 and 7, so it will return to you 7. Now, wherever the return value, it will be a replace of the function, which we will see out the 7. But if you look at our example here, right, remember, like someone just pointed out, we don't have see out here. So whatever it gets replaced here, it won't get print. Right, so what you want to do is you want the function so to print the hello, right? And I see people asking what data type is void, right? So for people says the void type, they probably have already have some coding experience. So voice, it's the type where you don't need to return anything. Right, so if you look at our function here, we know our function's name is say hello. And we will say hello to the user, and user is a string. Right? And then, so when we write the function in the parentheses, when we specify the input, right? When we specify the parameter, we need to give a data type and then name it, so we can say hello to a name. Right? And if you want to use user, that's also fine. But we will say hello to a person, so we will say hello to a name. Now, what it does for the for this function is we will want to see out hello, right? We want to say hello and then with a space followed by the name, right? Followed by the input. And that's pretty much it for the function. So we don't need to return anything. So if we don't need to return anything, we will use the void type. Now I see people asking what data type is void. So void is a type. So you can think of void means nothing. So you will use it when you want to return nothing, or when you don't need to return anything. So if you look at this function here, right, for this say hello function, you don't need to return anything. You just need to print a message on the screen. Now I see people asking, should we use user or name? It doesn't matter. You can, when you specify the input for the parameter, you can name it whatever you want. So remember here, it just we will specify the input, the parameter, as how we declare a variable. So you can name it whatever you want. So we will say hello to a name, so you can call a name. If you want to call a user, you call a user. It doesn't matter. Right, so whatever the input, we call it name, and then in the function, we will see out, we will say hello to the name. What's the name? Name is the input. So if you look at here, when we call the function, it passes in an argument called user. So user is the input, and what's user? User is whatever the string, right, you store, right? You will get that from the user for their name, and you will store it as the user variable, and then you will pass in as a parameter for this function. So when you pass in, wherever your user is your name, and then it will print hello to wherever your input. So the name here, the variable here, you don't need to have the same name because this is an argument. You just call the function just using it. As long as it matches the data type, it's fine. Good.
Professor,
Mhm.
do you need to return something in the main function, or can you also not return anything when you're using the main function? So is return 0 necessary to run the code, or you don't need it?
Okay, so for this return 0, you need it because if you look at the title line of the main function, what do you have for the return type?
If you use void main, would you need any?
You can use void main. So we will start it with the int main. Remember, that's our standard beginning. So our main function, it will always have the return type int. So we will just return so we will return like a value, like an integer value. Now, if you ask for the voice function, do you need the return? So the answer is you could leave it out. If you leave it out, you can still compile the program. It won't give you any error code, but it's a good practice to have it in because the return will tell you where you will finish the program. So where you will back to the it will return back to wherever you call the function. Now for this function, we will have the return at the end. So whether you have it or not, after you go through all the code here, you will return back to where you called it. But sometimes when you have like the bigger bigger function, you might want to return in the middle of your code, or you might want to return in the middle of your loop, right? Then you want to have a return there. So it's always good to have a return there just to remind you like where do you end the program. So for the void type, you will just have return and there's nothing after it. Besides that, it will return wherever the value that match with your result type. Good. Okay, so let's put the code in. Okay, so here it asks, who are you? And let's have an input Alex, and then he will say, hello, Alex. Any questions here? Now let's say I want to have another function called say, instead of say hello, I will have a function called say something. And then in the say something, I will pass in the user, and then you will have and then you will say something to the user. So let's say instead of saying hello, you will say hi to the user. So this will print hi, Alex. So it will have whatever you want to say something there, and then have a space, and then it will have the username afterward. So how do we have this say something function? And I see people asking, voice will not work without int. What does that mean? Voice will not work without int? Okay, I see people asking the function void has to be outside of int main function. Okay, so when we write the program, the main function it's where the program gets run. Now, whatever the function, right? The main here is a function. So when you compile a C++ program, it will run your main function. Now, whatever function addition to that, if you want to write any function on your own, you will write it outside of the main function. So you will define your own function. So you don't write the function inside of the main function. You will write the function outside of the main function. And normally we will or at least in our class, we will write whatever function you defined above the main function. Okay, and now how do we know what function to write? So pretty much whatever function you call in the main function, you will either need to have your function in some built-in library so you can call on it, or you will write the function on your own. Right, so for example, here the say hello function is not a built-in function. It's a function we write it on our own, so we have it here. We need to define that. If this is a function, you write it on your own, and you will write it outside of the main function. The void just means it's a function that where you don't need to return anything. Now, if you have a function where you don't need to return anything, normally it will print something on the console. Okay, and I see people asking, how do we know what comes first? If you look at the example here, it will take in the user, and then it will have the something that you want to say to the user. So you will print the message first, followed by the username. Right. So if you look at here, we have user and hi. We will print hi first, and then the username. So if you want to say how are you, then it will print how are you, Alex. Okay, so we know this is a function. It will print something to the console. And if you look at the main function here, there's nothing, right? We are not see out the function. So you just need to print something on the screen. So this will be a void return type again. So we have void, and then the function is called say something. And if you look at the function, we will have two input, right? We'll have a input user and a input like something, and they are both string type. So you will need to take in two inputs. So you have a string and a name, right? The username, and then here's the comma. And then you have a string, right? Wherever the message you want to say to the user. So you have string something. So in your function, you want to see out something, right? And then we will have a space to separate them, followed by the username. And then we will end the line. Return. So we just need to return. You don't need to return anything. This is example 3. Right, so let's add this code in. So we want to have this say something. And then we will pass in the user and then the message we want to print. So we'll have hi. Now let's just do another one. Let's say something. And then we have the user. Let's say you want to say how are you?
Don't you need a space after the comma?
No. We will, if you look at our code, we will put in the space for them. Right? Because normally when you have normally when you put in something, you will not put like an extra space at the end, right? So we don't do it. Right. So in the program, it does the extra space there.
Oh, yeah, I forgot.
Okay. So now we need to write the say something function. So again, it's void type. Say something. And then it will take in a string name and a string something. And then it will see out the something you want to say, followed by a space and the username. And then we can return there. I see people say there is a spelling error. In the
The
parameter.
string parameter, it says string something. You didn't add an E to something.
Yes, I missed a E here. Thank you. Okay, let me show you the code and then compile it. So you say, who are you? So let's put in Alex. So you see what we will have hello. Alex, that's from the say hello function. And then we have hi Alex from the say something. We want to say hi to the user. And then we have how are you, comma, and then we have the name. So we have how are you, Alex. Good. Now, in terms of the ordering, right, the order of the input. So whatever, like however you define the define the parameter, right? Whatever order you define the parameter, it will be the same order you take in the input. So the first argument, it will refer into the first argument. So it will refer to the first parameter. So if you look at it, the user, it will refer into the name, and then wherever you put in the string you put in next, it will refer into something. Any questions here? I see people asking, something is a data, right? Something is a string, right? If you look at here, or something is a string name. So if you look at it here, right? So, okay, so if you look at the say something function, it will take in two arguments, right? You see hello, and then here is hi. Now the user here is a string, right? That's how we defined it. So that's how you know the first parameter is a string. Now the second parameter, it's also a string, right? Because you see it's in the quotation. So you know you need to use a string type, like the string data, to store it. So when you write the say something function, you need to declare, or you need to define two input parameter, right? You will have two string parameter. Now you can name it whatever you want. So you know the first input, we will store the username, so I just call it name. Now the second parameter, it will be whatever thing you want to say to the user. So I will just name it something. You can name it whatever you want. So you treat that as a variable. So this, whatever the variable you put in here, it will store the second input. Now I see people asking, when there was void before a code before the if there's a void on the title line of a function, it will not print out anything. Okay, instead of saying print out anything, it will not return anything. If you look at the function here, it returns nothing. Which means when you call on the function, it will just run whatever the code there, and then you move on. It won't return anything. Right, so don't confuse the voice with the print function, or don't confuse the return type with print. Like the see out, it's you trying to print out whatever the thing you want to see out. You want to print whether the message or a number. Right, so you will see out whatever message. Where the return type is just like you will get the result type of your function. Right, so if you look at here, right, when we have the say hello, say something, it will just go into the code, run it, and it will return, and say it return nothing. So it will so this return pretty much just take you back to the function, and then you go to the next line. So the return will just complete the line, and then you move on. Where if you look at the first example, right, so the cube here, right, you want to see out the cube 1. Now what does cube 1 do? When you try to see out cube 1, what it does, it will take you to the cube function, and then it will return. So for cube 1, it will return 1 times 1 times 1. So it will return a 1. So it will return a 1 here. So instead you have the cube 1 here, you have a 1, since 1 is a result of cube 1. And you have the 1 here, you will plus a cube 2. Now what does cube 2 here? The cube 2 here will take you to the function, and they will return 2 times 2 times 2. So it will return an 8 here. But you are not printing the value, right? Because there's no C out anywhere. So you have 1 plus 8, and then you will look for the cube 3, and will return 27. Now what it does is, right, so those cube function, it will replace with the result type, and they have 1 plus 8 plus 27, which will give you 36. And then if you look at the main function here, you will see out the value. So you will see out the 36. Good. Okay, so if there is no other question, we will end it here, and I will see everyone Thursday.
Have a good night, Professor.
Have a
Thank
good
you,
night.
Professor. Have a good night.
Professor.